All right, constant listeners, it's September. By the way, that was a great Earth, Wind, and Fire single. Do you remember? Great band, Earth, Wind, and Fire. Innovative, jazz-infused. You had Maurice White, who formed the group back in Chicago, and Philip Bailey, he was great on vocals as well. I think Earth, Wind, and Fire actually are coming to Western Pennsylvania sometime in October, and maybe I'll go. Anyway, this is Nick DiOlius. You are listening to The Far Middle. This is episode 68. We have to address our dedication. And for 68, we're going to go to the world of hockey. And we're going to go with one of the greatest scorers, with one of the longest careers, one of the best haircuts, and one of the most fun to watch on the ice. His name is Jaromir Jagr. Now, he's from Kladno in the Czech Republic. He is not a communist. Jagr kept a photo of Reagan in his notebook growing up. That 6'3" frame, his size, it made him dominant early in his career, especially when he had the puck. He learned English as he lived in the United States. I remember when he was playing for the Penguins in Pittsburgh that he would give the weather reports on a local radio morning show as a marketing gimmick. It was pretty funny, actually. But his English today, I can tell you, is better than most Pittsburghers' English, including my own. Drafted in 1990, of course, by the Penguins in Pittsburgh. Went on to be part of those two great Cup teams right out of the gate when he joined the team. So they won the Stanley Cup in 91 and 92. He scored his first Stanley Cup Finals goal at age 20, scored over 1,000 points with the Penguins when he exited the team. And when he left, he was second in career points to only Mario Lemieux, who was our dedication, I'll remind you guys, at episode 66 a couple of weeks back. So Jagr, it was really fun watching him come of age when the Penguins were really rolling as a team and seeing him play with the greats, seeing him play with Lemieux, and Ron Francis, Kevin Stevens, Trottier, and so on. That was a lot of fun watching that as a sports fan. Now, Jaromir was a bit of a mercenary, I'd say, as a player. He went where the money was, and it was, good for him. That's what self-interest and capitalism are all about. You got the right and the wherewithal to do that. So he didn't get hung up much on laundry and logos of teams. He played for 9 NHL teams through his career. He played in Russia. In the middle of all that, he played in Italy. And he ended up back in his hometown playing in the Czech Republic. Great scorer, won the Art Ross more than any non-Canadian player in the history of the NHL. He won Olympic gold in Japan. He had 766 goals in the NHL, third all-time in goals career-wise behind Gretzky and Howe, until a guy named Ovechkin passed him recently, so now Jagr is fourth. And he's just shy of 2,000 points in his NHL career, and that puts him second all-time in career points behind only Wayne Gretzky. I don't think Jagr gets his due. Maybe he bounced around to too many teams for one. But more importantly, I think he's not the right national makeup, I'll call it, for the NHL hockey gods. Because, you see, there's a pecking order of preferred heroes in the NHL when it comes to its power base that you find in Toronto and in Ontario. So it's Canadian first, as in English-speaking Canadian. Then below the English-speaking Canadian players are the French-speaking Canadians. Then there's a big drop-off. Next come the Americans, then the Europeans at the bottom. So Gretzky and Howe and Orr and Messier and McDavid, they do no wrong ever. And, of course, they've got the resumes and the achievements to back a lot of that up. But then you've got Lemieux and Richard, who get respect, but never as much as the ones I just mentioned because they're French-Canadian. Then you got sort of the Chelioses and the Brett Halls and the Roenics, the Leaches and LaFontaines. Austin Matthews would be an example today up in Toronto, but fractions of the respect that English Canadians get. And then you've got the European players. You've got Jagr and Forsberg, Fedorov, those guys, Ovechkin as well now, who are basically viewed as minor leaguers. So wrong to view it that way, but that's the reality of the NHL power base. So maybe we do our part, constant listeners, to make it right by dedicating episode 68 to the great Jaromir Jagr. Time to connect dots now. In this episode 68 of The Far Middle, it's going to be our second ever lightning round. This is where, if you remember, we try to work our way through the deep list of items and issues to cover, but we're going to do so in a more to the point and summarized version versus some of the more expansive discussion that we've got on typical Far Middles. And it is unbelievable how much material stacks up for Far Middle discussion. I got to tell you, there's a deep bench and roster of items to get to. In some ways, that will excite and motivate me, but I got to tell you, in other ways, it concerns me because it's a sign there's a lot of dysfunction in the world, in society, and economies these days to talk about. In public discourse, that's the path to doing our parts. So in that spirit of public discourse, let's borrow a song title from Metallica and let's ride the lightning. Where else other than the far middle do you get Earth, Wind, and Fire linked to Metallica? Only here. Let's start by jumping from hockey to baseball. Have to talk about the trials and tribulations of that promising, that potentially generational player, Fernando Tatis Jr. for the Padres. He could be so good, but he keeps getting in his own way to greatness. First, he breaks his wrist, allegedly from a motorcycle accident. And if you think it's hard to believe that a guy making as much money as he does, and I think his guaranteed money right now is $340 million, but if you think it's hard to believe that somebody like that in that position would be doing so, riding a motorcycle around where you can be injured, consider a couple things. First, it happens more than you think. A certain Steelers quarterback, named after a famous clock in London, he comes to mind when he went headfirst without a helmet into an oncoming car's windshield when he was riding a motorcycle. Second, Tatis was not in one, but in a pair of accidents. So this is sort of funny, but not funny. A reporter asked him in spring training when the accident occurred to him, and his reply was, Tatis replied, "Which one?" Wow. Then Tatis tests positive for banned substances right when he was getting ready to return. 80-game suspension, done for the season, done for the playoffs, and also done for the start of next season. So does he own this issue? Nope. He says he thought it was something else. Then he or his dad, I'm not sure which, but one of them said that he got a fungus when he was getting a haircut, and he used something to treat the fungus that tripped the positive test. His dad goes on social media saying that millions of fans are going to stop watching baseball because of the suspension. So again, Tatis can be one of the best ever, but he's got to do better off the field. And until he does, the pressure is only going to build on him. Speaking of pressure, next item, how Russia's energy leverage and its geopolitical pressure, they continue to crush the EU, crushing the EU physically, financially, and emotionally. Consider the reality of what's going on today in Europe, and it's not even winter yet. So the first thing I saw in Berlin, 1,400 different locations have lights in public spaces that are now turned off at night, including its most famous landmarks. In Munich, city offices have turned off their hot water. Fountains are turned off at night in Munich. The Dutch government, it's telling its citizens to keep showers to under 5 minutes, almost like a shower duration advisory. Italy, right, where it gets hot in summer, it's saying that air conditioners cannot be set below 77 degrees Fahrenheit in public buildings. But in Spain, it's worse because it gets hotter than Italy in the summer. It says no air conditioners below 81 degrees Fahrenheit in public and commercial buildings. So Europe talked about its potential unity since there was the creation of the EU. And that has been largely a failed experiment. And it may not see the end of this decade if these strains continue to worsen. But perhaps the EU did manage to obtain one type of unity. I'll call it a unity of a collective shared misery that's stemming from disastrous energy policies. And that brings us to the next topic, still staying in Europe, but this time focusing in on the Dutch and Dutch farmers and what happens to them when environmentalism comes a-knocking. So I didn't realize this, maybe you did, but when you look at export of agriculture in terms of value, the Dutch are the second largest exporters of agriculture in the world behind only the United States. So they are a core piece of the food supply chain, which means the left and the environmentalists are going to want to target and go after them because it equates to control. You control food, you control lots of things, right? So the environmentalists, they push for, and the bureaucrats created the concept of Natura 2000. It's setting aside massive land areas to protect birds and other types of animal species. And when I say massive, I mean massive, as in 18%, almost 20% of the total land mass of the EU is caught up in this Natura 2000 effort. And Natura 2000 comes with a slew of regulations, some of which look to limit ammonia and nitrogen ambient atmospheric levels. And that means the Netherlands, to meet their ammonia and nitrogen targets under the program, they got to tighten the noose around agriculture and its industry and the farmers that work within it. Now, there's been some government studies or documents that have been leaked, and those government documents show that over 11,000 livestock farms in the Netherlands are going to be closed, and over 17,000 farmers are going to have to reduce their herds to meet these regulations or sort of goals under Natura 2000. You think this is going to make food supply worse? Do you think this is going to create more food scarcity? Do you think it's going to stoke and increase food inflation further? Here's another question for you. How does this improve the environment in any measurable way? Let me know if you find the answer to that one. So check out the EU and its Natura 2000 beast and what it is doing to Dutch farmers. There now is our future in the United States, because with the environmental left, it's a case of have regs, will travel. Oh, and that interesting brings up the next topic in Dot to Connect. So speaking of environmentalism and the left and the elite class who attack the doers and the individuals and the farmers, we have a few reminders from the past that I wanted to share. And the first comes from the author Paul Ehrlich, who wrote Population Bomb, the book Population Bomb in 1968. Stanford professor, part of the expert class, and the book predicted widespread famine and other calamities. I'm totally wrong, by the way, on all counts. And it basically was a book that advocated for population control to be the cure for all this stuff. But here is what the expert Ehrlich said, which is very telling to this day about many on the left and in the environmental movement. He said, quote, "Giving society cheap, abundant energy at this point would be the moral equivalent of giving an idiot child a machine gun," end quote. I'll tell you, you're not going to find a more telling statement from the left and radical environmentalists about their disdain for the individual and the human condition. And that brings me to the second reminder from the past and the next thought that I wanted to share. Some of you constant listeners have been asking me to call out prior predictions or prior calls to actions by environmentalists and leftists that were quite different than what these experts prescribe today for society and for you and for me. Well, that's easy, so let me give you two quick ones. There's a lot to choose from. First, did you know that a Sierra Club advisor, an expert to advise the expert, in the 1970s advised that we should double the use of coal? Now, why did the advisor to the Sierra Club advocate for that? To avoid and be able to shut down nukes. So now it's dirty coal because the enviros, they killed nukes. And that's the playbook that you see with environmentalists of divide, kill, on down to where there's nothing left for you to divide and kill, which means that you've achieved your goal. So first went nukes, then went coal, next up oil, but every form of energy is ultimately going to be on that list. It's just a question of in what sequence and when. Second one, to sort of compare and contrast from the past to today, Ralph Nader and the Sierra Club itself advocated for fossil fuels in the 1960s and 1970s to once again try to kill off nukes. Very different story these days from these very same experts. Strange. Is anybody paying attention? Sometimes you wonder. And those 280-degree reversal gems that we just covered from the so-called experts and champions of following the science brings us to the next topic of how science, as it was supposed to be applied, is dead. Patrick Michaels, that's somebody you likely never heard of, who recently passed away. He was one of the few climatologists, and I sometimes wince when I use that term, I just did right here, that dared to speak up and challenge scientific consensus. He said, "Scientists are rewarded for working within the paradigm rather than for challenging it, even as it may be failing in its explanatory power." Boy, how true. And we basically know why, right? It's because where the money and where the power are. If you run counter to or challenge the status and the scientific consensus, you lose out on the spoils and the subsidy and the consensus rain down upon the compromised scientists. And that leads to the next connection, one used to apply science to come up with a better or a bigger or a smaller or a more efficient to make money. Capitalism catalyzed science and both bettered the individual and society. The West won the Cold War because of this. The communists, they innovated nothing. They stole or they copied advancements. They continue to do that to this day. So today, however, this whole issue of capitalism driving science and vice versa and bettering the human condition, today what you see is the opposite. Now science is controlled and fabricated to confirm an ideological bias so they can then be used to set policy and allow state planning and pour subsidy of tax dollars from above. Those things, look, they're anti-capitalist, they worsen the individual, and they do not better society. And they deter scientific advancement. So the preference today is that science, it's static and it's not evolving, and that's not a good pair of things. So allow me to jump to the next thought in our lightning round to give you a couple of examples of this, what I'm just talking about here on this prior point, but on a very large scale that's occurring right before our very eyes. Let's take the comical Inflation Reduction Act. You wade through the details and you will see the big picture of massive capital reallocation by government policy. You got $250 billion that's being taken from the pharmaceutical industry, and then it's either consumed by government bureaucrats, like the IRS staffing expansion that we've heard so much about, or it's gifted to the climate change corporate industry of multi-billion-dollar corporations. Pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical industry saves lives. What cure will it not come up with now, because innovation is going to be stifled in the coming years due to the $250 billion that were taken from the industry to feed something else? How many lives are going to be impacted, and for what? To save the planet? Please. No, instead to feed even more of the private sector and creator wealth to the climate change complex. This $250 billion of new subsidy is on top of, don't forget, hundreds of billions more that's already poured into the corporate graft game known as, quote, combating climate change, end quote. By the way, that delivers us to the next item to discuss and connect. When anyone starts complaining about fossil fuel subsidies and ending them, here's a few facts to illuminate their minds and perhaps their surroundings with, get it, illuminating minds and your surroundings. Here's a couple of facts to consider. First, these are from University of Texas. And what the numbers I'm going to give you, they're on a $1 per megawatt hour basis to be able to come up with apples to apples comparison. So coal subsidy, when you add it all up on a $1 per megawatt hour basis, is 50 cents. Oil and natural gas are somewhere between $1 and $2 per megawatt hour. Wind is somewhere between $15 and $57 per megawatt hour. Solar is between $43 and $320 per megawatt hour. Unbelievable how much of a difference there is in subsidy of wind and solar versus fossil fuels. So the next time you're presented with two popular but flawed views, you're going to be ready, right? When you hear stop fossil fuel subsidy, yeah, only if we cut all corporate energy subsidy, because wind gets 50 times more and solar receives 300 times more. Stop all that subsidy and watch the speaker of stopping fossil fuel subsidy, watch him change course. Second thing you might hear from time to time, wind and solar are competitive, right? We hear that all the time. Of course they are not. That's why they require massive, massive levels of subsidy. And they only account for 7% of America's energy mix despite all the subsidy. Hugely uncompetitive, completely and exclusively propped up by the subsidy. And when you stop following the science and the facts and the math, and instead you start following the religion and the ideology, like we've seen with this energy policy situation, it leads to follow-on consequences. And that is a topic of our next lightning round connection. Capital markets caught the climate change fever years ago, and they now apply ESG investing across trillions of dollars worth of assets. And oftentimes the ESG approach, unfortunately, is muscled and forced, shoddy, it can be messy, and it ends up, when it's those instances, creating unforeseen risks to everyday people. And everyday people here, I'm talking about retirees and the middle-class workers of today who basically hold future interests in pension payments. So we have discussed public pension plans and the pension plans of city, state, and municipal workers and retirees who take their orders from politicians and bureaucrats that the politicians created the jobs and the power for. We've discussed that in the past. And I wrote a chapter on this subject in my book, Precipice, The Left's Campaign to Destroy America. Give that chapter a read if you get a chance. Buy the book if you haven't yet. And all this ESG investing, if it's not done astutely, and it is often not applied astutely, it's going to hurt return on assets of these public pensions. So state and city pension funds just suffered their worst fiscal year on returns since 2009. They were down almost 8% for the year and down almost 9% for the past quarter. That's creating a financial crisis that could threaten the pension checks of cops and firemen and sanitary workers and teachers. The middle class, basically, when you think about those professions and the people that pursue them and engage in them. So ESG is not entirely to blame for this, of course, but sloppy ESG investing is not helping the situation, and it can certainly be a significant contributor to the problem, making it worse. And then the pension feels pressure when it's facing funding gaps and perhaps even a solvency crisis, so it's got to find a way to boost returns on assets other ways. And that is our next topic to connect to, how pensions increasingly are amping up risk by investing in less liquid and more speculative asset classes like private equity. So think, and just as an example, we can consider here CalPERS, which is the biggest pension in the land in the entire US of A. CalPERS out in California now has 13% of its assets in private equity and more in real estate on top of it, which is similar to private equity in that it's less liquid and it's riskier than stocks or bonds. Now, CalPERS and other public pension plans, they're amping up the risk to hit returns and to avoid a funding crisis. And it's working to a certain extent, at least this year. Private equity and real estate returns, they were positive the past year, while stocks and bonds struggled. So for CalPERS, the past fiscal year, private equity and real estate returns were way up, while equity returns posted double-digit negative returns. So even though the plan returns are hurting, it would have been worse without private equity and real estate doing as well as they did. But what happens when these alternate investments have a turn down, or they go south, or they seize up, or they can't be sold quickly? Like Blood, Sweat, and Tears said, what goes up must come down. And when it or they do come down, look out, millions of retirees and workers who have their futures tied to the decision-making and abilities of these public pension fund managers and bureaucrats. Let's keep moving to the next connection. So we're talking about financial markets and basically talking about how politics is getting involved into what should be non-political matters like investing. Constant listener recently asked me about my thoughts on what Governor DeSantis is doing in Florida with his effort to combat the woke brigades. He signed a bill recently passed by the legislature that's called the Stop Woke Act. And basically, this bill, this law, would create or liability or stop universities or professors from expressing views in a classroom that would espouse or promote or advance anything that could make students feel guilty about history as it relates to things like race and gender. Now, this can create liability. This law can create liability for a university that ends up with a professor who's going to openly support a range of different things. Let's say affirmative action as an example. And it could impact private companies as well when you look to their diversity and inclusion training content that a lot of them employ and apply. And other states besides Florida are considering basically passing the same type of law. So what are my thoughts? Look, I generally like Governor DeSantis. I think Florida is booming for a reason. It supports free enterprise and the private sector. Those are awesome things. But as a classic liberal, which I am, I do not like this Stop Woke Act at all. I don't like it at all. And I would file this law under the two wrongs don't make a right category. Yeah, the left is roughing up dissent and free speech everywhere these days, especially on campuses and in boardrooms, and I am completely against that. Again, I wrote a book on that. The premise of a lot of our Farm podcast is based on that. But two wrongs do not make a right. And the argument of, oh, well, the left did it too, that doesn't work either. Professors should be allowed to express opinions and views and counter dissent. Same with businesses. Neither should be coerced or shut down by the state. So a true liberal is going to welcome free speech and the marketplace of ideas concept and individual rights. Censorship is censorship, and you don't stop censorship with censorship. The Stop Woke Act should not be copied elsewhere. Instead, we should protect more views, protect dissent, protect debate, public discourse. Don't limit those things. Whether it is this side or that side, doesn't matter. The best way to combat the censorship that you see coming from the left these days is to nurture free speech, not instituting the same form of censorship on the opposition. And controlling speech and subjectively picking those to control and those not to based on political views, it drives us right into the next topic, which is an update some of you have asked about with the Colorado River in this summer's drought. Hey, I'm happy and surprised to learn that many of you share the same interest that I've got in water flows of the great world rivers. We talked about the Ganges River and the Colorado River from prior episodes of the Far Middle, and I've received a decent amount of feedback. I wasn't even going to talk about those things. I was a bit hesitant. I'm happy to see that the people are interested. So let's talk about government control of water in this case and how such control is not consistently applied across the board so that it can be used to pursue political favoritisms or political paybacks. So anyway, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management of the federal government, it's pointed to the drought that's going on in the West this summer, and it said it's time to force cuts to the water takes of states from the Colorado River. So Arizona and Nevada, along with Mexico, they've seen significant forced reductions in their water takes from the river coming up in 2023. And these cuts are going to hurt each state's and Mexico's economies, and it's going to drive up the cost of food since agriculture is a big consumer of water from the Colorado River. But guess who the largest user of water from the Colorado is? It's California. And guess who did not have to make any reductions or forced rationing of their water take when the BLM ratcheted down on Arizona and Nevada and Mexico? That's right, California. Is BLM being consistent? Nope. Is the Bureau of Land Management playing politics with water? Yep. Does anyone in the media or academia or the federal government raise the issue? Nope. Nothing to see here. Business as usual. How about where it's not business as usual with government going in the wrong direction, but instead where government is actually going in the right direction? I found an example of this, and I'm really excited about it. I wanted to share it with you. It deals with, believe it or not, hearing aids. And the FDA recently allowed certain hearing aids to be bought without a prescription and over the counter. That's awesome. That makes a tremendous amount of sense. And the way it was made absolutely no sense, because if you think about the logic, you had a situation where a kid can buy headphones over the counter in a store that ends up wrecking their hearing, but an adult can't buy hearing aids to restore their hearing over the counter. Come on, that doesn't make any sense. So why was that the case? Maybe, just maybe, because the government was lobbied to require a doctor's prescription so that the medical profession could enjoy a monopoly and controlled market when it came to those who are hearing impaired and need hearing aids. So the requirement was created to protect the medical lobby and hurt the consumer and the patient. This recent move, it's a step in the right direction. My advice to the FDA, keep going. So it's time to wrap up our second ever lightning round. I hope you enjoyed it. I had fun with the quicker pace. Now, this being the first week of September, I'd like to close with paying homage to one of the most underrated albums of the 1990s and one of the most underrated voices that you'll find in pop. On September 3rd, in 1990, George Michael released what I believe to be the masterpiece album, Listen Without Prejudice. Now, George Michael, he gets a lot of criticism and heat, sometimes because he's most famous in many ways for his shallow stuff or more shallow stuff with Wham in the 1980s. I get it. It's not exactly highbrow or deep music. And the guy, he's a bit of a train wreck personally, and he suffered a too early death because of it. But this individual, George Michael, he had a great generational voice, very soulful, one of the best out there during his time, without a doubt. And this album, Listen Without Prejudice, it's a classic. Not enough people talk about it or know about it. Didn't sell well in the United States, definitely didn't sell nearly as well as his predecessor album, Faith, did. But give it another listen if it's been a while, or check it out if you've never had a chance to listen to the album. The most popular hit on Listen Without Prejudice is Freedom 90, of course. Everybody knows that. They love that video, where he doesn't even appear in the video, by the way, personally. But my favorite song on that album is Waiting for That Day. Awesome song. And this album, constant listeners, it's very, very good. So if you're waiting for that day when the next Far Middle appears, you don't have to wait long, just about a week. And on this episode, 68 of the Far Middle, one where we covered everyone from Earth, Wind, and Fire to Metallica to Blood, Sweat, and Tears to George Michael, it's over and out for now.